Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 252. And this time I'm going to talk about Led Zeppelin's fifth album from 1973 on Atlantic, Houses of the Holy. What I have here is one of Jimmy's remastering efforts from 2014. Some people say this is a little bit sterile sounding. For me, I don't know. I think it's kind of hard to fuck this music up. They're by now pretty much the biggest band in the world. They're the biggest concert draw in the world. In some respects, they don't have a lot left to prove, so maybe at this point it's time to stretch out. So on this record, we get a bit of prog rock, we get a beautiful ballad, we get a couple of almost parody numbers of funk and reggae, three pretty damn good rockers, and an excellent swords and sorcery Norse epic. It's also notably the first Zeppelin record without any kind of an electric blues number, and so it's evidence that the band had more tricks up their sleeve than was first thought. It's by some distance, I think, the poppiest and lightest feeling record they ever released. Even though there is some pretty heavy music on here, overall it's kind of an upbeat, carefree kind of a vibe, and not too surprising perhaps, as the band were enjoying great days and would do all the way through until 1975. Led Zeppelin's fourth album had come out in November 1971, and it's safe to say that that record was, and still is to this day, well received by the record buying public. They toured to support it, although the rate of touring was down a little bit from the frenetic touring they did through 1969 and 1970. Between November 1971 and March 1973, they played something like 75 concerts, maybe a few more. This compares to more than 200 in 1969-70 over a roughly comparable period, though those 75 gigs were played on three different continents. Immediately after the fourth album came out, they played the UK in November and December 1971. They then went down to Australia and New Zealand in February 1972, hoping to stop in Singapore along the way, but getting turned away at the airport for having long hair, in an incident which made headlines around the world at the time. In the late spring of 1972, they played the USA and Canada, and at that point they began to introduce some of the songs which are actually on this record, including Dancing Days and Over the Hills and Far Away. They then go to Japan that fall in October, and it's on that tour where Robert's voice, which had been pitched at a very high level for many of their most famous songs, begins to crack. And if you listen to the boots from that particular tour, it's clear he can't reach the high notes on songs like the Immigrant Song, which very quickly start to disappear from the repertoire. They toured the UK in the winter of 1972-73. They released this record in March, and then in May and June of 1973, they go on a fairly triumphant tour of North America. On that tour, they broke all kinds of box office records and really changed the way in which rock concerts happened, because they were moving from being a club and theater band to being a stadium-only band. And from that point on, they were really not playing venues of fewer than 15,000 people. In Tampa, in May of that year, they set a record for 58,000 attendees at one show. This level of success also sees the band thinking about spreading their wings simply beyond recording and touring. They start to think about forming their own record label, which of course they do in 1974 with the establishment of the Swan Song, and they also want to get into making films. And the film, The Song Remains the Same, is actually based on footage shot in New York in 73, although of course it wasn't released until 3 years later. The tracks on Houses of the Holy are written and developed and involved and recorded between the latter part of 1971 and August 1972. As early as 1971, they'd be messing around with early versions of what would become No Quarter when they were recording at Headley Grange using the Rolling Stones Mobile. Now, they loved the Rolling Stones Mobile, or at least the product they'd gotten from the combination of that house and the mobile studio, because it gave them so much flexibility in terms of where they could record in the house, around the grounds, ambient sound, and so on. Of course, famously, the drum sound from When the Levee Breaks comes from setting up the drum kit in the stairwell. So they wanted to replicate the experience for their next record. The location was going to be different, however. While they were in Australia, it was arranged that they would use Stargroves, which was Mick Jagger's estate. Now, if you're a Stones fan, you know that in 71, 72, the Stones were having significant issues with taxation, and so they'd become tax exiles. So at this point, Mick was living with the rest of the Stones in the south of France in Nelcott, in this house they'd rented, and not living in his English house for tax purposes. So Stargroves was available. So off they go to Stargroves, and they also get the Rolling Stones Mobile in again, and they bring over Eddie Kramer from New York to be the engineer. The sequence of albums for which the mobile studio was used is kind of remarkable, and it had an interesting winter. It had previously been in Montreux around Christmas time when Deep Purple was there recording their album Machine Head. It then was taken down to the south of France for the Stones to record most of the tracks for what would become Exile on Main Street. Then in April it was brought back to England so Zeppelin could use it at Stargroves. When they got to Stargroves, they already had, as I mentioned, No Quarter. Page shows up having worked up pretty reasonable versions of Over the Hills and Far Away and the Rain Song. The rest of the songs on here are largely pulled together in jam sessions which happen at Stargroves, which isn't too surprising when you think about, well, at least for me anyway, the slightly dashed off feeling of some of the songs here. They then went back to London in May, did some more recording at Olympic Studios, including, ironically enough, the song which was to have been the title track to this record, which gets left off and eventually gets released on Physical Graffiti in 1975. That, of course, is the song Houses of the Holy. They then go off to reconquer North America at the end of May 1973. On the way, while they're in New York, they pop into Electric Lady Studios and do a little bit more recording. Apparently, in that session, they cut a whole bunch of golden oldies, like a whole bunch of Elvis covers, which I guess Jimmy still has in the vaults and has yet to release. This album has always been kind of controversial amongst fans because of suspicions or the reality of the pitch of Robert's voice being adjusted in several of the tracks. As far as I can tell, there are only 2 tracks on here where the pitch is actually known to have been messed with, and only one of those isn't actually made higher, and that is on this very first track, The Song Remains the Same. This track was known as the Overture for much of its early life. If you listen to the bootlegs from the Japan tour in the fall of 1972, it's certainly introduced as such, and it certainly has an overture kind of aspect to it. It's a much more complex composition than the blues rock that had been their stock in trade. So it's about as, well, maybe until Achilles' Last Stand, it's about as proggy as they were getting. And as far as I'm able to determine, the deal with Plant's voice is that the whole song was recorded in a lower key and then sped up. Next is the Rain Song, which always followed The Song Remains the Same in concert as well as on the record. An absolutely beautiful song. The story, of course, is that George Harrison complained they never wrote ballads, so Jimmy writes a ballad, and on top of that there's a joke in there because the first 2 notes are the same 2 notes as in the George Harrison song Something. Over the Hills and Far Away, with the riff that launched 1,000 acoustic guitar careers and one of the best examples of so-called light and shade, which exists in their catalog. The final track on side 1 is that oddity, The Crunge, which is the James Brown either tribute or parody song. It's a bit of a flex because it's not an easy song to play and the rhythm section is really locked in. This was actually written by Bonham. It was written as a song which you deliberately could not dance to. Side 2 starts with Dancing Days, which is a great rocker with some fantastic guitar work and this zany, high-pitched riffing from John Paul Jones on the organ, which I only just realized after listening to this song probably 500 times that it's not guitar. The next song, Mak'er, is their notorious reggae effort, although really the only thing which is actually reggae on this track, because Bonham is playing some kind of mashup of different kinds of styles, the only thing which is actually reggae on the track is the piano, which is a bit buried in the mix. So I never really think it counts as reggae, and I think it's a pretty good song. Mind you, it isn't of the same scale or grandeur as the next track, No Quarter. Now this is epic. Bonham is amazing here, the guitar riffing is fantastic, but really this is a showpiece for John Paul Jones, and much more so in their live shows. And a shout out here to their February 16th, 1975 performance of this song in St. Louis, which is pretty much the gold standard, and I put the link to that in the description below. The final track, The Ocean, captures the poppiness and the upbeatness which characterizes much, if not all, of this record. It's got this giddy coda with a walking bass line which brings this eclectic and lighthearted album to a close. This record shows the incredible vein of songwriting this band were in, with confidence just oozing from them, being on top of the rock and roll pile after their first 3 years. When the US and Canadian tour to support this record was complete by the summer of 1973, it took a break for a year and a half, which was probably deserved. But after Plant lays the mic down at Madison Square Garden on July 29th that year, things would never really be that good again. So what you have here is a document of a group that's pretty much at its peak, that's now willing to try different things and is able to pull those things off. There are a few gimmicky things that don't quite work, but in general there are some epic performances and some timeless tunes which have only seemed better with the passage of time. For me, this is 4.5 out of 5 stars.